In 2025, amphetamines aren't just the study drug you know from memes. They're part of a massive, legally and illegally blended market, driven by a sharp rise in prescriptions and diversion since the 1990s. They've become fuel for students, coders, soldiers, and even busy parents. But here's the problem: the brain was never designed for this constant chemical pressure. Amphetamines don't simply sharpen focus, they raise dopamine and norepinephrine unnaturally by reversing transporters and disrupting storage, flooding circuits built for balance. Society frames this as productivity. Neuroscience frames it as risk. And strangely enough, this isn't new. In the 1950s, the same drugs were packaged as a cure for housewife fatigue, sold as safe little helpers for mood, energy, and slimming. What's changed is less the chemistry than the setting. To see why, we need to look closely at what these stimulants actually do inside the brain. The everyday brain hack we don't talk about. Think of it this way: your brain has something like a motivation dial, one that normally shifts up when life throws something urgent or exciting at you and drifts down when routines drag on. Amphetamines don't just nudge that dial a little higher, they push it far past its ordinary range. Suddenly, tasks that felt dull only minutes ago can feel charged with meaning. A student staring blankly at a dense reading assignment might, after a pill, find themselves genuinely absorbed, as if the work has transformed into something important. The task hasn't changed. The chemicals deciding what feels valuable have. The science here is straightforward but powerful. Amphetamines work mainly by increasing both tonic and phasic dopamine signaling through dopamine transporter reversal, and by interfering with how neurons normally store those chemical signals. That means more dopamine and norepinephrine are available, altering the brain's sense of what matters. Dopamine acts like a priority tag, telling you which actions deserve effort. Norepinephrine sharpens vigilance, narrowing the spotlight of attention so competing distractions fade into the background. Together, the effect feels like discipline or even intelligence, but really it's a redirection of existing resources toward whatever happens to be in front of you when the drug peaks. And that effect cuts both ways. The student may indeed find it easier to read through chapters late into the night, but the same force could lock them into obsessively reorganizing a folder or scrolling endlessly online. Focus becomes powerful but not always wise. The system that once filtered tasks by natural salience has been chemically tipped, so meaning is assigned not by context but by neurotransmitter levels. Over repeated use, these surges don't leave the circuits completely untouched. Animal and non-human primate studies show that long exposure can alter dopamine markers and connectivity patterns, pointing toward structural plasticity. Yet the human picture remains complex. At therapeutic doses, especially in ADHD patients, the long-term trajectory is still actively researched. What we can say is that over time, repeated artificial elevation nudges the reward system toward treating the presence of the drug as the signal that certain tasks deserve energy. Without it, ordinary activities may feel muted. This is the subtle cost beneath what feels like a life hack. You aren't just amplifying your ability to work longer hours or block out distractions. You're adjusting the circuitry that decides what is rewarding in the first place. The sense of agency still feels intact. After all, you're the one turning pages or writing sentences, but the underlying motivation has been edited by chemistry. That's why even routine chores can start to feel mission critical, a phenomenon that feels natural in the moment, but is, in fact, manufactured. This everyday brain hack is so effective precisely because it doesn't feel foreign. Stimulants don't announce themselves as forcing priorities, they simply make things seem important. And because that effect feels seamless, it's easy to mistake chemical urgency for authentic desire. That's what makes them both useful and risky. They can create clarity, yes, but just as easily turn trivial tasks into obsessions. Understanding this mechanism sets the stage for the bigger story. The brain isn't the only thing amphetamines have been used to reshape. Across history, they've also been turned into tools for reshaping social expectations, what counts as being productive, disciplined, or even functional. And the way those expectations were sold has shifted dramatically depending on the era. From housewives to hackathons. In the 1950s, amphetamine pills were not linked to all-night coding sessions or exam marathons. They were sold to suburban wives as solutions for tiredness, low mood, and stubborn weight. Advertisements of the time showed cheerful women in spotless kitchens, tablets in hand, with promises of renewed energy and lighter bodies. The pitch was not danger but domestic convenience. Pills were presented almost like nutritional supplements, small, brightly packaged aids a woman could rely on to keep housework, childcare, and appearances under control. The chemistry may have provided focus and appetite suppression, but the marketing sold an image, the ideal of effortless feminine diligence. That image was built on earlier precedents. During World War II, amphetamines had been widely distributed to soldiers to fight fatigue and sharpen alertness. When peace returned, the habits and legitimacy of wartime use carried into civilian life. Benzodrine and related stimulants now flowed into the home market, reshaped as diet aids and pep pills. By the mid-1950s, rainbow pills, combinations of amphetamines and other drugs, were targeted at women who felt drained by repetitive domestic cycles. Regulation at the time was minimal, and in some clinics and walk-in diet shops, stimulant prescriptions were routinely and casually issued. That open-handed availability blurred the line between medical treatment and cultural expectation, with tablets offered as quick fixes to structural strains of daily life. Seen against that backdrop, the cultural role of stimulants becomes clear. These drugs are rarely introduced to the public as stark neurochemical agents, something serious-sounding or inherently hazardous. Instead, they are framed as everyday aids for fitting into the roles society defines. In the decades after the war, the role was cleanliness, composure, and slimness. What mattered wasn't just the pharmacology, but the story, that a woman could and should meet her tasks without visible strain. Pills turned fatigue, stress, or hunger from social problems into individual chemical issues. They worked quietly as instruments of conformity, shifting the burden from society to the individual who was told, implicitly, that she could be adjusted to match her environment. By the late 1960s, concerns over misuse were widespread. In 1970, the Controlled Substances Act placed amphetamines under stricter scheduling, acknowledging their addictive potential and tightening oversight. But control did not end their role. Prescriptions persisted in various forms, especially in weight loss programs, and illegal diversions kept supplies in circulation. The cultural framing adjusted once more. No longer pitched primarily to housewives, stimulants began surfacing among students, truckers, and other groups who faced long, demanding hours. The message remained consistent with earlier decades. When biology lagged, chemistry could close the gap. Through the 1980s and especially into the 1990s, prescriptions began rising again, this time linked to psychiatric diagnoses. ADHD became a primary clinical justification, and new branded formulations entered the market promising safer, more targeted use. Legal production and prescribing expanded sharply in the 1990s and 2000s, even as diversion into non-medical use grew alongside it. The result was that stimulants regained a broad cultural presence, this time not only tolerated but actively legitimized by medical authority. While regulation tried to balance public health concerns, the reality was a widening stimulant economy that moved fluidly between formal prescriptions and informal networks. That transition sets the stage for the modern parallel. Today, a university student cramming for finals or a software engineer facing back-to-back deadlines draws on the same basic mechanism as housewives once did: dopamine-enhanced motivation directed at socially defined performance. The context differs, but the model repeats. Stimulants are framed as tools for bridging limits, aligning personal energy with external demands. The promise is not rest but sustained productivity, not a spotless kitchen but a flawless code release or an uninterrupted exam session. A chemical intervention originally marketed for homemaker fatigue now powers a knowledge economy where attention itself is a currency. The term functioning has always hidden shifting standards. In the 1950s, it meant meeting domestic obligations with a steady smile. In the 2020s, it means producing output, hitting deadlines, and coping with unending digital demands. In both cases, drugs reset the baseline of what counts as enough. Each generation adapts to new standards and absorbs medicated performance as if it were natural ability. The underlying neurochemistry stays nearly identical. Altered dopamine signaling creates urgency, norepinephrine sustains alertness. What changes is what society decides those effects are for. Housewives once required cheer through monotony. Students and workers now require late-night stamina for quick returns. Throughout both eras, stimulants have not primarily been defined as illicit vices. Instead, they were woven into ordinary life under a veneer of medical legitimacy. In the 1950s, advertising reassured women that pills were safe helpers. In later decades, formal prescriptions and professional authority reframed them as therapies, with side effects minimized in promotional language. Serious drawbacks like insomnia or jitteriness were treated as manageable inconveniences, overshadowed by whatever outcome was most celebrated, whether thinness or productivity. The pattern is consistent: physiological strain recast as negligible, cultural rewards magnified as essential. Taken in historical arc, the story illustrates how stimulants work as mirrors of societal priorities. They adapt not just neurons but narratives, reflecting what kinds of labor, presentation, and endurance are valued at different times. The continuity is striking. The tools of domestic cheer in the 1950s are cousins to the cognitive enhancers of the tech sector today. Amphetamines have followed society wherever its demands have most strained individual capacity. And with each shift, the baseline expectation of what a capable person looks like moves further beyond unassisted biology. Understanding this continuity matters for seeing the present moment in context. The tools have not changed dramatically at the level of mechanism. Enhanced dopamine and norepinephrine remain the engines, but their scale and scope of use now outpace any earlier period. From a mid-century kitchen cabinet to today's professional landscape, stimulants have become deeply normalized, always framed less as exceptions than as aids aligned with cultural priority. That steady escalation makes it essential to ask how widespread usage now defines normal functioning, and what it signals about the pressures shaping a new generation. It is with that wider lens that we can observe how, by 2025, stimulant use has expanded far past niche medical categories or isolated personal use. The sheer volume of prescriptions, diversions, and informal consumption has turned the modern stimulant economy into a central feature of everyday work and study. And it is this scale, not just individual stories, that best captures the reality of our time. Generation Adderall, the numbers behind 2025. Generation Adderall has a set of numbers behind it that are difficult to ignore. By 2025, research shows that more than 1 in 5 people prescribed stimulants report misusing them within the past year, while about 18% of prescriptions are estimated to be diverted to others. Together, these figures make a simple point. This is not a side issue or a niche corner of college life anymore. It is a broad current running through student culture, workplaces, and households, shaping how performance and focus are maintained across daily life. On college campuses, the impact is especially visible. Pills slip from one hand to another in dorms just before exams, folded into the routines of studying as casually as opening a laptop. In such settings, the distinction between prescribed and non-prescribed use becomes blurred, sometimes impossible to parse. For students locked into competitive environments with constant deadlines, the question is less about the legal status of the pill and more about whether you have the stamina to stay in step. When diversion is this common, inequality develops. Some students run on enhanced concentration while others fall behind, not because of ability, but because access is uneven. The story doesn't end with graduation. For young professionals, particularly in tech-driven fields, demands are relentless. A day fragmented into rapid-fire emails, shifting project priorities, and constant virtual meetings leaves little room for natural fatigue. In this environment, stimulants become normalized as a tool that helps certain workers adjust to expectations they might otherwise fail to meet. The framing is subtle, no policy mandates their use, but as some individuals embrace chemical reinforcement, the culture begins to shift. Deadlines are met, productivity levels rise, and before long the baseline of what counts as normal performance ratchets upward. Others feel pressure to keep up, not through formal requirement, but through peer comparison. This is where enhancement becomes culturally accepted, even if it is never officially enforced. Freelancers and gig workers, often imagined as having freedom over their schedules, face a variant of the same pattern. Flexibility can mean instability, long stretches without work punctuated by moments of surgical efficiency when projects arrive. Pills compress energy into those windows, providing focus when the opportunity comes. In this way, chemical reinforcement slips into the foundations of the digital gig economy, where output is measured by bursts of intense activity rather than steady hours across a week. The stimulant quietly becomes one more tool in the kit, its presence barely acknowledged but increasingly central. Behind these personal stories lies a structural reality. The stimulant economy operates through both formal and informal channels that are deeply interwoven. Prescriptions, written in clinics and dispensed in pharmacies, frame the official side. At the same time, a shadow market of diversions, resales, and casual trades circulates the exact same pills beyond their recorded origin. Capsules produced under pharmaceutical regulation often move within days into informal distribution, shifting smoothly between spheres of legitimacy. Effectively, the two markets are one. From an economic perspective, that overlap magnifies scale. Pharmaceutical companies post growth tied to prescription rises, with ADHD diagnosis driving steady demand through the 1990s and 2000s into the present. Parallel to those legitimate profits, resale inflates the total amount of use in hidden but significant ways. Because each diverted pill originated in the legal system, the two realms reinforce one another. Misuse rides on the infrastructure of legitimacy. Pills carry institutional credibility even while used outside prescribed boundaries. Numbers anchor this cultural evolution. With nearly 1/4 of prescription holders misusing and nearly 1/5 diverting to others, the typical assumption of stimulants as tightly controlled medicines no longer holds. By sheer prevalence, these drugs have shifted category from niche therapy into broad cultural infrastructure. Students dose before finals not as rebels, but as participants in a common pattern. Professionals extend concentration not as outliers, but as part of a general ethos of productivity. The intertwining of medicine and culture becomes so tight that describing proper use versus misuse no longer captures what is actually happening. Normalization feeds back into medical practice as well. Clinicians face rising numbers of patients describing difficulty concentrating in overstimulating, tech-heavy lives. Some articulate textbook ADHD symptoms. Others describe struggles that arguably stem from cultural overload rather than biological disorder. The line thins, doctors responding to pressure for performance and relief prescribe. Patients situated in contexts where stimulant use is normalized present symptoms that merge genuine impairment with circumstantial strain. Each reinforces the other, pushing prescriptions higher, building a self-sustaining cycle. By 2025, what distinguishes this moment is both scope and depth. Students, tech workers, freelancers, corporate employees, each group rationalizes its usage with different language, but the chemical effect is the same. Dopamine and norepinephrine surges reorganize attention, lending urgency to whatever task is nearest. A paper, a line of code, a client deck, all are infused with the same drive. This convergence makes stimulant use less situational than generational. The question isn't who dabbles, but who abstains. For many, routine exposure begins through prescription, for others through casual use among peers. Rarely is the experience framed as transgressive. More often, abstaining carries the stigma, choosing not to medicate risks being perceived as limiting your own competitive edge. The shift amounts to a redefinition of baseline. Where stimulants once represented exceptions, a wartime aid, a housewife's helper, a student's cheat, they now represent continuity. They are woven into the structures of learning, work, and self-maintenance as ordinary support. This does not mean every worker or student relies on them, but it does mean their presence has so thoroughly infiltrated the landscape that they shape the expectations within it. In that sense, Generation Adderall is not just a demographic, but a cultural condition. To fully grasp what it means to live in a stimulant-saturated era, it helps to move beyond the numbers and distributions and focus on what is happening inside the brain itself. The most striking effect isn't external, it's the way attention and motivation are reorganized at the neurochemical level. That shift begins with dopamine, the signal that decides what matters. When dopamine becomes a dictator. When dopamine stops acting as a guide and instead starts acting like a ruler, its influence changes everything. Under normal conditions, dopamine helps set priorities. It marks which signals deserve attention and which can be ignored. That filter allows someone to notice a knock at the door while tuning out the hum of a fan. It constantly sorts between distraction and relevance. Biologically, this function is less about producing pleasure than about shaping motivation. It keeps effort aligned with tasks that matter, sparing energy from being poured into irrelevant details. Without that filter, daily life would feel chaotic, as though every sight, sound, or thought demanded the same level of response. Amphetamines disrupt this balance. Biochemical studies show these drugs both block dopamine transporters and promote reverse transport, forcing cellular stores of dopamine into the synapse while also interfering with vesicular storage. The result is unusually high extracellular dopamine and norepinephrine. This mechanism, described in clinical reviews, makes the brain's salient system far more intense than it was designed for. What was once a graded difference between low and high-priority inputs becomes a surge in which many stimuli feel equally urgent. For the person taking the drug, the immediate effect can feel powerful. Long, demanding tasks that once seemed exhausting suddenly carry the momentum of interest. Distractions fade and concentration sharpens into a form most people rarely experience in daily life. This immersion often resembles flow, where action feels easier, fatigue recedes, and time slips by unnoticed. A student moving line by line through a dense textbook may feel as absorbed as an athlete in training. A coder debugging a string of errors may remain engaged hour after hour without slipping into frustration. The neurochemical reinforcement makes the tasks feel not just possible, but intrinsically worthwhile. Yet dopamine floods do not discriminate. Just as a work assignment can feel meaningful under their influence, so can reorganizing a closet or editing a music playlist. The chemistry doesn't sort high-value tasks from trivial ones, it merely stamps both with the same level of urgency. A person can devote hours to minutiae with the same conviction that normally belongs to deadlines or life goals. The surge is persuasive precisely because the chemistry imitates the brain's genuine signals of importance. From the inside, it doesn't feel misplaced. What looks externally like misapplied effort feels internally like real progress. These distortions can create the illusion of exceptional productivity. Someone on stimulants may feel more focused and motivated than ever, pouring effort into revisions, tweaks, or side projects. But viewed against bigger goals, that labor may not advance as much as the feeling suggests. This explains why stimulant experiences often oscillate between breakthrough achievements and periods of oddly misplaced commitment. The brain has not gained new skill or wisdom, it has gained conviction, an unquestioning sense that whatever it is doing deserves intense attention. Because the mechanism affects perception of value, people often mistake stimulant states for higher intelligence, greater discipline, or increased capability. In practice, the drugs do not change reasoning ability. They bias what the system treats as rewarding and then provide drive to pursue those things. The person feels more competent because the work in front of them feels more significant, yet the underlying decisions are not more accurate. This is why strong users describe both transformational output and wasted hours. The experience itself cannot reveal which it is moving toward. Over repeated use, the brain adapts. The exaggerated dopamine floods recalibrate motivation, shifting expectation for what engagement should feel like. Without the drug, ordinary conversations, chores, or assignments no longer provide the same sense of urgency or purpose. Compared to the heightened state, daily life feels muted. This change doesn't just affect productivity, it reshapes meaning. Activities that once felt naturally worthwhile appear flat as if they lack importance. Dependence emerges not only from the desire for sharper concentration, but from the need to feel that tasks deserve energy at all. Seen this way, the real problem is less about exhaustion or withdrawal crashes and more about a long-term distortion of agency. Each dose biases the brain toward treating random activities as significant, convincing the person that effort is authentically chosen rather than chemically nudged. From the outside, the effect looks like more work getting done. From the inside, it feels like freely pursuing valuable goals, but the goals are being amplified by neurochemical push. The user may believe they are harnessing control, when the motivation system itself has been steered toward intensity over accuracy. This biasing effect is subtle but profound. Amphetamines don't assign importance with precision, they make nearly everything feel important. That is why the experience can inspire both legendary accomplishments and time lost to obsessive trivialities. The conviction is real, but its direction is unreliable. Raising the brain's motivational volume does not increase accuracy about what deserves effort. It simply makes all signals louder and harder to resist. In that state, dopamine functions more like a dictator than a guide. It issues constant reinforcement, pressing the individual to care deeply without evaluating what is actually worth caring about. The system that once distinguished relevant from irrelevant is drowned out by uniform urgency. The person works harder, feels clearer, and believes they are on the right track. But the target of that drive may be either essential progress or meaningless detail, both indistinguishable from the inside. This is the paradox at the heart of stimulant use. Drugs that seem to grant control may actually narrow it. They heighten perseverance but can misdirect it. They elevate focus but flatten discrimination. For some, this alignment happens to match urgent work and yields impressive results. For others, it locks attention onto diversions that deplete energy. The deciding factor is not intelligence or discipline, but where chemical urgency happened to land. Recognizing how fragile this balance is opens up the next question. The effects of stimulants look very different depending on who's taking them and why. The same pill that biases motivation indiscriminately in one context may act as a corrective signal in another. This contrast underlies not only medical treatments but also cultural debates. What counts as therapy in one brain can resemble enhancement in another, and the line between the two is thinner than most people assume. Therapy tool or cheat code. When doctors prescribe stimulants for ADHD, the goal is not to grant someone an artificial upgrade in focus or endurance. It is to address a system that chronically underperforms. In many ADHD brains, dopamine signaling is inconsistent and weaker than in typical brains. The cues that normally mark a task as worthwhile do not transmit with enough strength. As a result, homework, conversations, or daily chores can register as unrewarding regardless of their importance. Medication strengthens those signals, making effort feel connected to potential payoff where previously there was only emptiness. Short-term studies reviewed in psychiatric literature consistently show that stimulant treatment is effective for this purpose, and in the therapeutic window is generally considered safe and well tolerated. What remains less clear, however, are the long-term consequences of extended use into adulthood, an area researchers emphasize needs further investigation. For patients who respond well, the experience is not one of being propelled into a heightened state, but of being stabilized. The medication does not flood their lives with sudden energy or extra thrill. Instead, it restores balance, quiets internal distractions, and reintroduces the ability to feel genuine momentum behind tasks. People often describe this as finally being able to start assignments without paralyzing delay, or to keep working without their attention fracturing in minutes. Clinicians sometimes liken it to a prosthetic. Just as a prosthesis restores movement without providing superhuman speed, stimulants restore attentional control without manufacturing something unnatural. The drug allows a person to reach a baseline of functioning that others with typical signaling already experience daily. The picture is different for those without this deficit. In a neurotypical brain where dopamine systems already perform reliably, the same compounds do not restore weak signaling but amplify normal capacity. This can flood functioning circuits with intensity beyond what the body would naturally generate. Changes include prolonged wakefulness, surges of motivation, and a suppression of fatigue. To that user, the effect does not resemble balance, it resembles augmentation. The contrast is subtle yet central. For some, stimulants return the brain to level ground. For others, they stack extra capacity on top of an already stable platform. Most experts now describe this not as a rigid dichotomy, but as a spectrum. A single pill may function as prosthetic medicine in one case and as performance aid in another, depending entirely on the state of the brain receiving it. There are important safety points as well. Controlled trials reviewed by the FDA highlight that rare adverse reactions can occur, such as psychotic or manic symptoms, in roughly 1 in 400 stimulant-treated ADHD patients. While uncommon, this possibility is serious enough that clinicians monitor patients closely, particularly during initiation or dose changes. Awareness of such risks grounds treatment in caution without dismissing its potential benefits. The goal is not to discourage therapy, but to underscore that pharmacology never acts in isolation, and that vigilance is part of responsible use. Another point often overlooked in public debate is timing of treatment. Evidence suggests that when stimulant therapy begins in childhood for ADHD, it is not associated with increased risk of later drug abuse and may even reduce it by stabilizing self-regulation early. Meanwhile, when prescriptions begin in late adolescence or adulthood, the data are less clear, with some indications of different or more complex outcomes. Such nuance matters in real-world decisions, since cultural debates often treat all use as one category when the developmental context significantly influences risk. In competitive environments, the functional differences introduced by stimulants drive the most difficult ethical questions. A student without ADHD may take them to study longer, memorize more with fewer breaks, and push through nights that otherwise would collapse under fatigue. These effects do not represent heightened intelligence, but they do allow endurance and persistence that can exceed peers relying on unaltered attention. Within classrooms or exam halls, this advantage raises fairness concerns. Some universities treat unprescribed use as academic dishonesty akin to cheating, while others highlight health dangers more than competitive distortion. In either case, the issue reveals how society struggles to define boundaries around cognitive enhancement. Work environments pose the same questions but with less visible oversight. Rarely does an employer investigate whether deadlines were met with stimulant assistance, yet the global culture of productivity quietly incentivizes artificial reinforcement. As some employees enhance their endurance through medication, the baseline of expected output rises for everyone. Soon the line between taking a drug to simply function and taking one to excel feels indistinguishable. The system rewards performance outcomes, not the means, and that creates pressure for adoption even absent explicit coercion. On the level of individual experience, differences blur further. A student who has not been formally diagnosed with ADHD might discover stimulants through peers and feel immediate relief from the constant derailment of attention. Are they enhancing or are they unknowingly treating an impairment? Another person with no underlying deficit might justify use by citing stress or overwork, convincing themselves it is a protective tool rather than an upgrade. In both cases, perception of necessity shapes the narrative of use more than medical categories do. What emerges is less a binary than a continuum. At one end are therapeutic patients whose daily life is dramatically improved by restored signaling. In the middle are users with uncertain diagnostic status or unexamined conditions, inhabiting shades of both treatment and enhancement. At the other end are deliberate enhancers who know they are gaining extra capacity but accept the trade-offs. The pill itself is constant, but its meaning changes with the context of the person swallowing it. Stimulants can restore baseline or magnify it, and most real cases sit somewhere in between. A helpful parallel comes from vision correction. Glasses given to someone with impaired sight restore an ability taken for granted by others. The same glass, configured differently, can magnify objects beyond natural clarity. Both are transparent lenses, both placed before the eyes, yet one restores and one enhances. Society welcomes one as medically necessary while questioning the other as unfair or excessive. Stimulants function with similar ambiguity, operating as either restoration or amplification depending on who takes them and for what purpose. This duality explains their uneasy reputation. They cannot be dismissed solely as dangerous recreational substances, since millions benefit from them legitimately in clinical contexts. Nor can they be comfortably separated from performance enhancement, since widespread off-label use demonstrates how powerfully they extend endurance in competitive atmospheres. They occupy a space that touches medicine, culture, and ethics simultaneously. And because of this, each swallow carries layered significance. Treatment for one person, advantage for another, or perhaps a mix of both. The consequences are not theoretical. The broader their use has become, the more cultural expectations adapt to their presence. What once counted as sufficient effort or normal attention now meets comparison against stimulantated performance. While the therapy versus cheat code debate continues, something more subtle is occurring. Stimulants don't just change brains, they change baselines. Recognition of this shift sets the frame for the next question. If chemical focus can redefine what counts as normal, what happens when those same substances start to promise not just better concentration, but more time itself? The illusion of infinite productivity. The idea that stimulants expand your capacity often begins with their simplest effect. They let you push beyond the point when your body would usually stop. Instead of yielding to fatigue as night turns into morning, you remain alert, your mind sharpened against the weight of sleep. Hunger dulls, meals slip past unnoticed, and what nature once demanded for rest and recovery is repurposed into hours of wakeful work. To many, it feels like reclaimed time, as though a pill can override the body's natural schedule. The appeal is not excitement or euphoria, but efficiency itself, the sense that ordinary limits have been suspended. But this sensation is misleading. The drug doesn't replenish your reserves, it overrides the warning systems built to enforce them. Instead of regenerating energy, stimulants mute the signals of exhaustion. For a project or an exam, the effect can feel like a breakthrough, several hours of unfaltering study where usually you'd have slowed down. Yet when the dose fades, those alarms return louder than before. Fatigue hits suddenly, mood drops, and motivation craters. The crash that users describe, irritability, emptiness, even short spells of depression, aligns with well-documented withdrawal symptoms found in stimulant misuse research, especially fatigue, mood swings, and low drive noted in amphetamine and methamphetamine abstinence studies. The crash is less a dramatic collapse and more the body reclaiming the energy debt it was forced to defer. Occasional users might endure this as the cost of a single overnight push. For regular users, however, the cycle reshapes daily life. The stimulant ceases to create extra time, it defines baseline productivity. What once felt like an optional boost gradually turns into the minimum required to feel capable at all. Without it, routine work feels flat, heavy, and unimportant. The drug shifts from enhancer to lifeline. At this stage, taking it is no longer about producing more. It is about staving off the drag that follows abstinence. This shift reflects the development of tolerance. The brain adapts against repeated surges by dampening its response, meaning the same dose quickly loses impact. What once induced hours of sharp focus eventually sustains barely enough concentration to get through basic tasks. To recapture the earlier intensity, users increase the dose. As noted in multiple reviews, this escalation raises the risk of side effects such as sleeplessness, anxiety, cardiovascular strain, and erratic mood. The cycle is simple but remorseless. Tolerance leads to higher doses amplify risks, and each adjustment redraws normal around chemical support. Still, it is important to stress that not everyone will fall into dependency. Clinical use at therapeutic doses, especially under medical supervision, has a lower risk profile. The danger increases with high doses, long-term patterns of non-medical use, and polysubstance use that overwhelms the system. Those risk factors separate those who may experience a contained therapeutic benefit from those who spiral into escalating reliance. But where cultural narratives blur those lines, it's easy for users to see themselves as managing stress strategically, when in practice they are sliding into the same adaptive loop that fuels misuse. The illusion feels powerful because at first stimulants seem to increase control. You choose when to take them, you decide which work to do under the drug's influence, and you enjoy the surge of accomplishment. But gradually the relationship reverses. The chemistry begins to dictate when you can feel able to act. Without it, motivation does not just weaken, it feels absent. This is why long-term users often describe life off the drug not as painful withdrawal but as hollowed baseline. The difference is subtle but corrosive. Fatigue feels heavier than before, concentration more elusive, and achievements harder to sustain. Normalcy feels inaccessible without external aid, even when no overt symptoms of physical withdrawal appear. Society rarely pays attention to this pattern. Narratives focus on productivity, higher scores on exams, more lines of code, faster reports. The spotlight falls on output, not on how dependence reshapes what it takes to function over time. But the same system that once seemed to increase capacity steadily trains the user to need its presence. Eventually, productivity isn't enhanced at all, it is maintained at a cost. The extra time boosters promised is balanced out by crashes, exhaustion recovery, and the quiet erosion of unassisted drive. In the long span, more hours awake do not mean more hours gained, they mean hours borrowed, hours that must be repaid with interest through fatigue and mood distortions. The cycle itself is what sustains the illusion. Early on, stimulants feel like a cheat code. They let you bypass the limits that hold others back. Over months or years, though, those original limits remain. Sleep, hunger, and rest still claim their place, pushed off temporarily, then collected in bulk. Meanwhile, tolerance dulls the benefit and dependence makes abstinence feel impossible. Users end up chasing not excess productivity, but the feeling of just enough to keep afloat. From the outside, it still looks like enhanced output. From inside, it feels closer to survival. The illusion of infinite productivity is not that stimulants fail to extend wakefulness or sharpen attention. They absolutely do. The illusion is in believing this state is cost-free, that chemistry can strip out biology's requirements indefinitely. It cannot. The body adapts, the brain reshapes its reward circuits, and the result is a system dependent not on natural cycles but on scheduled surges of medication. The longer the pattern continues, the harder it is to distinguish genuine effort from chemically enforced urgency. The narrative that smart use equals infinite gain conceals a more realistic picture. Energy is borrowed, motivation is induced, and sooner or later the account must reconcile itself. Dependency is not inevitable, but prolonged high-dose or non-medical use nudges the probability upward. And where misuse persists, the sense of autonomy is traded for the obligation to keep dosing to feel normal at all. The same chemistry that once supplied confidence ends up dictating minimum functioning. The alternative is rarely discussed but always available. Structuring study sessions into focused intervals, ensuring consistent sleep, and applying behavioral methods, like cognitive behavioral therapy approaches for managing procrastination or distraction, build stamina gradually and sustain it over the long term. Unlike pharmacological reliance, these strategies do not erode baseline motivation. They strengthen it. For those caught in cycles of dependence, recovery often involves relearning these natural tools, rebuilding pace without constant chemical input. And it's there that the wider context becomes clear. Stimulants prove effective for extending focus and compressing fatigue, but their longer trajectory does not stop at temporary wakefulness. With repeated use, the brain begins to change in ways that shift its baseline wiring itself. What feels like a short-term performance decision feeds into processes that actively reshape attention and motivation over the long game. Neuroplasticity, the long game. Stimulants are often judged by the hours they keep you awake and the concentration they seem to provide. Yet their most consequential influence may emerge not in moments but across years, inside the shifting architecture of the brain. By 2025, research has moved past dopamine surges measured in hours and turned its attention toward what repeated stimulant exposure does to neural circuits over the long term. The pattern that emerges is less about temporary boosts and more about how repetition shapes wiring itself. At the center of this discussion is neuroplasticity, the ability of the brain to change its own structure. Normally, this capacity ensures learning and adaptation. Practicing a skill strengthens relevant synapses, neglecting one allows pathways to weaken. Daily life continuously reshapes circuits to match experience. With stimulants, however, the repeated experience is an artificially large burst of dopamine and norepinephrine. The brain begins treating this amplified signaling as its new reference point. Even mundane tasks, when chemically paired with sharp dopamine spikes, are learned as unusually rewarding. Over months or years, the nervous system accommodates this level of stimulation, teaching itself to expect it. Some of the strongest evidence for this reshaping comes from structural studies. Reviews of neuroplasticity research report that repeated amphetamine exposure in animals produces long-lasting changes in dendritic spines, the small outgrowths where neurons communicate. These changes appear in brain areas central to cognition and reward, including the prefrontal cortex and striatum. In non-human primates, Rickwood and colleagues found that weeks of Adderall-like dosing reduced markers of dopamine function in the striatum, highlighting just how sensitive these circuits are to regular stimulation. What this means for humans at therapeutic levels remains unsettled. Translation is uncertain, and current psychiatric reviews emphasize that long-term neuroimaging in patients is a priority for the field. The prefrontal cortex, which manages planning, decision, and self-control, shows particular vulnerability to remodeling. At first, stimulants strengthen circuits tied to persistence and focus, qualities users subjectively notice. Over longer exposure, however, other pathways lose flexibility. Some researchers describe this as a trade-off. The brain becomes excellent at single-minded pursuit, but less capable of shifting quickly or postponing gratification. What feels like liberation from distraction can slowly bias circuits toward rigidity. The striatum tells another part of the story. This region shapes how much weight the brain gives to incoming rewards. Stimulant-driven dopamine repeatedly floods these neurons, shifting their scale of reference. Over time, natural rewards, food, hobbies, social interaction may feel muted next to the chemically enhanced signals the brain has conditioned itself to expect. It is not that pleasure disappears, but that the calibration has changed. Tasks without chemical reinforcement may no longer carry much pull, leaving daily motivation blunted once the drug wears off. Adolescents and young adults face even more delicate circumstances. These are years when the brain engages in large-scale synaptic pruning, narrowing networks based on activity. Chronic stimulant exposure during this phase can bias which connections are reinforced and which are cut away. One consequence is that a developing brain may be sculpted around drug-linked dopamine levels, leaving it accustomed to artificially elevated reinforcement. For those who begin use in college or earlier, this means habits and motivations are laid down on a neurochemical landscape skewed far from baseline. Evidence on whether these adaptations reverse is mixed. Some imaging studies suggest partial recovery is possible once use stops. The density of dopamine transporters may climb back toward typical ranges and behavior gradually normalizes. In animal research, certain dendritic changes also regress with abstinence, yet other findings caution that not every pathway snaps back. Circuits repeatedly trained on high-intensity signals can remain biased, and some spine changes persist long after the drug is removed. The consensus is not clarity but uncertainty. Adaptations sometimes improve, sometimes endure, and no study yet defines the precise boundaries. This uncertainty makes language like irreversible misleading. A more accurate picture is uneven. Some studies in animals and non-human primates show long-lasting alterations, while human results are mixed. Longitudinal neuroimaging in adults on sustained therapeutic regimens is limited, and more data are needed before firm conclusions can be drawn. Reviews emphasize the need to identify which individuals are most vulnerable, possibly through genetic markers, environmental factors, or dosage histories. In fact, psychiatric recommendations now stress the importance of long-term human imaging and genomic studies to pinpoint risk profiles so that treatment remains as safe and targeted as possible. Although mechanistic details are still being mapped, the concern can be put simply. Repeated stimulant exposure can bias which synapses grow stronger, forging efficiency in some tasks but narrowing flexibility overall. A brain consistently trained in these conditions becomes specialized in focusing under chemical reinforcement. Without that reinforcement, everyday activities feel harder to sustain. This turns a short-term aid into a design principle of the brain, the equivalent of sculpting marble along a new line that may or may not suit every later use. From a motivational standpoint, compression of the reward spectrum poses one of the most serious long-term questions. Human signaling systems evolved to respond to both modest and large variations in reward. Dull chores prompted mild effort while survival needs pressed urgent action. Stimulants compress this range. They elevate mundane actions closer to survival-level reinforcement. In doing so, they teach the brain that weaker cues are not worth much attention. After years in this altered state, the absence of medication is felt less as neutrality and more as disengagement. Recovery requires teaching the brain once again to value the full gradient from small rewards to large goals, a process that can be slow and incomplete. For those discontinuing use, adaptation means more than tolerating tiredness or mood swings. The real challenge lies in retraining circuits to respond to naturally scaled signals. Habits such as regular exercise, structured routines, and non-chemical reinforcement strategies play a role in this rebalancing. Yet when neuroplastic changes have consolidated deeply, relearning proceeds unevenly. For some, baseline motivation resurfaces steadily. For others, ambivalence lingers for years. The imprint of sustained enhancement continues shaping behavior, even if the drug itself is gone. Seen as a whole, the implications extend well beyond individual productivity. Stimulants influence the very system that encodes motivation, altering structures designed for lifelong balance. These changes accumulate gradually, not through instant damage but through repeated adaptation. The effects resemble habits written in biology rather than choices made day by day. This is why many scientists frame stimulant use less as a temporary intervention and more as an environmental condition that guides development. The practical conclusion is not alarmism but caution. Structural plasticity reviews demonstrate that repeated exposure can leave an imprint on connectivity. Non-human primate experiments underscore that even clinically relevant dosing can alter markers of dopamine. Human therapeutic use may operate differently, but without long-term imaging research, the full boundaries are unknown. As professional guidelines emphasize, understanding who is at higher risk and when treatment is safe requires decades of careful follow-up, not assumptions drawn from isolated results. Researchers now call for longitudinal imaging paired with genetic analysis to refine risk assessments and improve safeguards. In this light, stimulants appear not as simple switches for productivity, but as agents that actively shape how circuits organize across time. Their influence is measured not only in improved study nights or work hours, but in altered neural landscapes across years. The long-term story of stimulant use is less about bursts of energy and more about how the motivational system itself is trained to value or devalue the world. This perspective shifts the debate. The question is no longer just about whether stimulants enhance performance today, but about how they guide development over decades. Every pattern of use leaves a trace in neural structure, and once written, those traces shape future choices and behaviors. In this sense, they are less like tools you borrow and more like conditions that redirect how the brain grows. This understanding sets the backdrop for the next turn in the story. As widespread use has highlighted long-term risks, some have begun experimenting with subtler strategies, hoping to capture benefits while avoiding extremes. Microdosing and the new frontier. By 2025, a different kind of stimulant use began gaining attention, not in underground settings, but in offices, co-working spaces, and remote home setups. Instead of taking a full therapeutic dose or using stimulants recreationally, some people started taking slivers of a pill fractions below what would normally register as a standard effect. This approach, called microdosing, was framed as gentler chemistry, a way to lift attention slightly without plunging into jittery peaks or obsessive tunnel vision. Its promise was modest but appealing, a quiet boost to focus and flow, without the volatility that higher doses often impose. Supporters describe the results as subtle. Instead of waves of intensity, they report a faint sharpening of perception, a steadier appreciation for work needing care rather than urgency. For activities like drafting, editing, or strategy sessions, the drug is said to operate in the background like low-volume static, making sustained effort easier without overwhelming direction. In contrast to strong doses that can swing between manic productivity and burnout, microdosing feels, to those who practice it, like a calmer balance. But here the distinction is important. These impressions are anecdotal experiences, not validated outcomes. Scientific studies at low-dose levels remain scarce, leaving enthusiasm far ahead of evidence. At best, microdosing stimulants is currently an untested experiment rather than an established technique. Neuroscience gives some clues as to why low-dose users sense differences. Even small amounts influence dopamine and norepinephrine signaling, but without flooding synapses in the way higher doses do. In principle, the result is a gentle encouragement toward focus, more like easing gears into alignment than slamming the accelerator down. What users describe as improved creative flow may reflect that subtle recalibration. At the same time, clinicians note that this reasoning is preliminary, not confirmed. The Mall Psychiatry Review stresses that almost all existing stimulant research tracks full therapeutic dosing, not chronic subtherapeutic levels over months or years. Whether microdosing avoids tolerance, reduces dependence, or creates its own separate risks has yet to be determined. Part of the appeal comes from the idea that, unlike high-dose use, microdosing might sidestep the familiar crash-and-burn cycle. Users often say they feel steadier, not caught in the spike and slump of larger doses. Yet medical experts caution this perception may be misleading. Tolerance develops gradually even on small amounts. What once feels like a manageable fraction can, over time, dull in effect, nudging the person towards slightly larger pieces. That slow escalation is well documented across stimulant history. Microdosing does not remove the biological patterns of adaptation, it may just slow the pace. The risk is not dramatic collapse but creeping reliance, with users confident they are in control long after tolerance has begun reshaping their baseline. This subtlety creates another concern. Because microdosing rarely produces visible overstimulation, it can disguise its own costs. A user may not notice compulsive patterns forming or the quiet difficulties of discontinuation until they become entrenched. Reports of withdrawal from stimulant misuse highlight fatigue, mood swings, and depressive episodes as common features of abstinence. Whether microdosing leads to milder but still disruptive versions of these outcomes is a question without strong data. What is clear is that absence of dramatic symptoms does not equal absence of risk. Alongside biology, microdosing carries social implications. The perception of safety and subtlety makes it attractive in professional contexts. If a colleague is sharper without effort, why wouldn't you consider the same? This creates the possibility that microdosing may start to appear not just as a private experiment, but as an informal expectation. If certain groups internalize the idea that chemical fine-tuning is normal, those outside this pattern risk falling behind, not for lack of talent but lack of enhancement. Access flows unequally here. Individuals with stable prescriptions or financial means can monitor dosage more carefully, while others rely on informal supplies, exposing themselves to inconsistent quality or hidden health costs. This widening gap mirrors the same inequalities already seen in diversion patterns at larger doses. If microdosing gains traction, the edge it offers may only be reliably controlled by the privileged few. Some critics question whether microdosing addresses the wrong target entirely. The method rests on the assumption that brains must be adjusted to fit an overload of deadlines and stimuli. Productivity is treated like engineering, a system to be tuned until it runs without pause. Yet the pressures that drive distraction, nonstop notifications, grinding hours, cultural pressure for constant responsiveness are environmental, not biological. In this frame, microdosing does not challenge the conditions that stress attention. It helps individuals mold themselves to the conditions while leaving the root causes untouched. The worry is not just health but culture. That microdosing reinforces the idea that relentless output defines what is normal, and that biology must be recalibrated to meet it. Long-term evidence on microdosing stimulants is thin. Controlled studies are almost entirely lacking, and much of the enthusiasm comes from personal reports, blog posts, and productivity culture, not clinical testing. Whether tolerance builds slowly, whether dependence develops differently, and what effect years of low doses have on brain structure remain unanswered. Reviews consistently stress that current evidence cannot establish microdosing as safe or effective. To present it as a refined solution risks overselling what is, at present, a gamble, one that has not yet proven to spare the user from the same cycles already known in higher dose use. Still, the idea captures imaginations because it promises control. Microdosing suggests you can keep chemistry on your side without giving it full command, shaping focus without distortion. For people anxious about overstimulation or dependence, it can sound like a perfect compromise, yet the lack of data makes this compromise speculative. A future generation of studies may clarify whether this subtle strategy makes sense or whether it quietly delivers the same trade-offs more slowly. Until then, caution is prudent. Microdosing promises subtle control, but with so little solid data, the jury is still out. This uncertainty raises a bigger question. Why has controlling chemistry become so central to how people navigate work and attention in the first place? To answer that, we need to step back and consider the world our brains were actually built to manage, a world whose pace once looked very different from today. Brains built for a slower world. For most of human history, daily life unfolded at a pace that matched the kinds of attention spans our brains were built to manage. Small groups lived closely together, with relationships limited to a few dozen people, rhythms guided by seasons, and tasks stretched out over hours or days. The brain's motivational system was well tuned to this pattern. Rewards appeared rarely, but when they did, they carried immense weight. A successful hunt meant food and survival. A secure shelter meant safety. Cooperation within a family or tribe reinforced bonds that kept everyone alive. Each event triggered meaningful dopamine release, embedding behavior that mattered. In between, life was quiet. Long stretches of routine gave time to rest and recover. The attention system evolved to function best in this pattern of scarcity, punctuated by reward. Now the environment has flipped. Stimuli that evolution prepared us to encounter occasionally are now delivered in torrents. Every notification, every update, every highlighted headline creates a microsignal that mimics meaningful cues. What once was a rustle in the grass hinting at prey is now a buzz on a phone, and the same neural mechanics respond. Instead of filtering for a few truly important moments, the brain is asked to react to hundreds within an hour. The system wasn't designed for this density. It interprets floods of signals as floods of importance, dispersing attention thinly, leaving less energy for deliberate focus. The mismatch is not because attention itself is weak, rather, brains evolved for lower frequency reward environments, and today's constant novelty overwhelms that calibration. Work and study settings magnify this gap even further. Modern productivity requires sustained attention across monotonous or fragmented tasks. Knowledge workers must sift through streams of email, toggle between projects, and operate in highly structured digital systems while resisting constant distraction. Students navigate coursework packed into compressed schedules, readings, assignments, and deadlines stacked in rapid succession. This demands extended focus without pause, which runs counter to natural rhythms built around bursts of attention and recovery. Brains adapted to thrive with intermittent challenges and communal cooperation now face constant solitary endurance tests. As a result, normal dopamine rhythms cannot keep up, leaving many to feel depleted even before they begin. This is where stimulants appear to fit the environment perfectly. A pill raises dopamine and norepinephrine signals, making ordinary tasks feel vivid, purposeful, and worth sustained effort. The chemistry doesn't make the world simpler, it makes the brain tolerate its intensity. Instead of relying on natural spikes of reward, it manufactures urgency so emails resemble survival cues and spreadsheets feel mission-critical. The effect is like updating old hardware so it can run new software. The environment doesn't slow, so the brain is pushed to run faster. Users experience this as newfound focus, but it is less a correction than a workaround. The drawback is that this adaptation comes at a cost. Evolution designed attention to incorporate pauses, to treat boredom as useful, to encourage recovery. Dopamine systems built resilience by valuing balance. Dull stretches encouraged energy conservation, pleasure followed rest. When stimulants repeatedly override this, the brain learns different lessons. Instead of treating downtime as natural, individuals come to see it as failure. Each signal is pursued as though vital, eroding patience. Fatigue becomes intolerable rather than expected. In repeatedly forcing energy forward, people lose the protective capacities that slower rhythms once provided. Over time, a person accustomed to these chemical nudges struggles with slower states. Quiet feels empty, waiting feels unbearable. Natural pleasure from small rewards blunts because the system has been recalibrated to expect surges. What once supported long-term stability, steady energy, tolerance for delay, capacity to rest, gradually fades. From the outside, this may look like high performance. But across decades, the foundation weakens because the core evolutionary assets of patience and recovery are being sidelined. This doesn't mean the brain itself is broken. It means it is being used in conditions that erode its strengths. This tension shows up clearly in adolescence. As the Mall Psychiatry Review notes, the teenage years are already marked by large-scale dopaminergic reorganization. Circuits that guide attention and motivation are being rewired more rapidly during the stage than at almost any other point in life. That makes young people especially sensitive to stimulant-driven plasticity, as elevated dopamine during this period can disproportionately shape which connections are reinforced and which are pruned. In other words, the mismatch between environment and biology is magnified for those still developing. What feels like a chemical fix in the short term may leave longer imprints where flexibility should remain. When viewed this way, what many see as dysfunction, difficulty in maintaining hours-long focus, or restlessness in monotonous contexts, may instead be evidence of a system working as evolution intended. Dopamine was designed to amplify bursts of focus, not sustain endless vigilance. Fatigue was meant to enforce limits, not to signal defect. The modern interpretation of short attention spans as pathology often ignores this context. The so-called failure is really a reflection that the environment has stopped resembling the one brains were optimized for. Stimulants mask this clash. They can sustain focus beyond natural thresholds, making high-volume work possible and muting fatigue that would otherwise intervene. But the presence of these drugs does not change the mismatch itself. The social context still imposes unreasonable speeds, the devices and deadlines still multiply inputs far beyond natural tolerance. What stimulants achieve is not resolution but substitution. They replace patience with manufactured urgency. They cover fatigue instead of restoring resilience. They shift responsibility for balance away from culture and onto chemistry inside the individual. This substitution is not neutral. Each time endurance is chemically forced, the underlying adaptive strengths diminish further. People experience high output, but the cost is an erosion of natural pacing and recovery. Over time, they no longer trust their own capacity to sustain effort without external reinforcement. Productivity feels possible only when paired with pharmacology. The result is a narrowing of agency. Rather than choosing when and where to act, individuals become tied to cycles of dosing that set those terms for them. What seemed empowering can morph into dependency not just on the drug itself, but on a worldview where biology is expected to bend around demands. It is worth noting that alternatives do exist. Behavioral therapies such as cognitive behavioral interventions for attention, as highlighted by Harvard Health, show lasting improvements in managing distraction and building structured focus. Regular rest, deliberate work design, and healthier rhythms support motivation without eroding the underlying system. These approaches work slowly, but they align better with the way motivational circuits were designed to recover. Compared to pharmacological fixes, they strengthen the baseline rather than replacing it. The difficulty, of course, is that such changes require cultural and structural support, something far harder than swallowing a pill. And therein lies the broader tension. Stimulants make individuals feel aligned with modern demands but leave those demands unchallenged. From the perspective of a user, the drug restores control, but from the perspective of evolution, it redirects adaptation away from sustainability. The brain feels natural when medicated because the chemical state matches what the environment requires, not because the environment has been made natural for the brain. Comfort and capability are bought at the cost of deeper reliance on workarounds. When we frame stimulant use against the long span of human development, the lesson is less about broken minds than about misplaced contexts. Brains crafted for intermittent novelty now exist in a storm of constant novelty. The label of deficiency often masks what is simply incompatibility. A system designed to conserve is asked to accelerate nonstop. Chemical fixes bridge the distance without solving it. That leads to a critical question. If today's pace demands faster brains, should the solution be to reshape brains until they comply, or to reconsider the speed of the world itself? The answer matters not only for individuals, but for how entire systems of work, school, and health evolve next. The unseen costs to society. When stimulant use reaches into millions of lives, the effects no longer belong just to users. They seep into the structures that organize work, school, healthcare, and even entire economies. The Forest Systematic Review underscores how widespread this has become. Roughly 22.6% of those prescribed stimulants report past-year misuse, and an average of 18% of prescribed medication is diverted to others. These figures reveal an ecosystem where prescribed pills consistently flow into informal channels, fueling outcomes well beyond what medical guidelines intended. What started as individual aid now has collective consequences, shaping how institutions are built and how society defines what counts as normal performance. In the workplace, the pattern is subtle but powerful. Employers rarely demand medication outright, but institutions benefit from the output it produces. High productivity becomes the unspoken standard, and expectations creep upward as some workers chemically extend their attentional limits. The standard is quietly recalibrated, not by policy but by comparison. A team member on stimulants handles more hours of focus, and soon that higher level of concentration looks ordinary, even when it is anything but. The system profits from enhanced output while presenting the illusion that such capacity is naturally sustainable. Education reflects the same logic, but on a generational scale. Students navigating competitive coursework measure themselves against peers who study hours stretch late into the night on chemical reinforcement. At first, enhancement looks like an edge available to a few. Over time, it becomes the invisible baseline against which everyone is measured. Test scores, GPAs, and admissions benchmarks rise alongside stimulant circulation, so abstaining begins to look like voluntary disadvantage. Success merges with neurochemical support and inequality intensifies, not purely because of talent, but because access to enhancement is uneven. Grades cease to reflect only comprehension, they reflect access to chemical focus. Healthcare becomes the hinge between these demands and their supply. Clinicians must parse genuine medical need from social pressure disguised as symptom reports. The outcome is predictable. Prescriptions climb in step with cultural expectations, and once medication enters circulation, a portion leaks into informal use. Studies cited by the Forest Review describe common diversion mechanics. Surplus medication sold or shared, students approached directly by peers, pills stockpiled and passed between friends. This gray market thrives because its sources are legal to begin with. The healthcare system is left in an impossible role, gatekeeper and supplier at once, drawn into a cycle where prescriptions feed both therapy and enhancement simultaneously. What emerges is not a conspiracy of institutions forcing drugs, but networks quietly leaning on them. Workplaces gain steady productivity from stimulant-powered employees. Schools normalize achievement standards set against enhanced study endurance. Healthcare fields demand for prescriptions that mirror cultural pressure as much as biological disorder. Families inherit these shifts in subtler ways. Parents spending longer hours in chemically reinforced focus arrive home too depleted for ordinary connections, while children raised in these environments learn early that focus itself can be medicated. Across these domains, the outcome is the same. Human rhythms that were once natural, boredom, fatigue, mental drift, are recast as flaws in need of correction. On a national scale, productivity rates climb in step with stimulant prevalence. Countries with high prescription and use rates may enjoy momentary competitive advantages in innovation and labor endurance, but at the cost of anchoring economic growth on chemically sustained output. In such environments, the stimulant is no longer framed as a personal tool but as an invisible pillar of competitiveness. This raises the risk of policy responses not grounded in health but in competition. Chemicals become infrastructure by default, with nations hesitant to slow momentum even as evidence of long-term costs grows clearer. The family domain adds another quiet dimension to these costs. Parents under pressure extend their professional capacity through medication, but the inevitable crashes or long recovery phases often leave less energy for children or partners. Kids absorb this normalization early, seeing stimulants as simply part of what it means to keep up. By adolescence, a time when dopamine networks are still reorganizing and especially sensitive, they may encounter these drugs directly, whether through formal prescriptions or informal channels. The cultural narrative passed on is simple: success and effort are inseparable from chemical support. The cycle becomes generational, embedding stimulants into identity and competence alike. Over years, these patterns accumulate. Institutions embed stimulant-supported performance as though it were infrastructure, much like electricity or broadband, assumed to be present, not questioned. The hidden cost lies in shifting baselines. Ordinary human variation in attention or energy is no longer tolerated as part of the spectrum of performance, but redefined downward as failure. Those who abstain find themselves out of step not only with peers, but with the very institutions that have recalibrated standards around neurochemical enhancement. What began as a shortcut becomes a silent requirement. The risks of dependence or tolerance are typically discussed at the level of individuals, but in these broader patterns, the greater issue is structural reliance. Work structured around chemically sustained endurance, schools built on enhanced concentration, healthcare pulled toward servicing cultural pressure, together they form a closed system. Productivity soars, but so do healthcare costs, inequalities, and hidden black markets. Through diversion and informal trade, prescriptions turn into community supply chains, making stimulants part of everyday logistics rather than limited medicine. At this point, society no longer treats stimulants as extraordinary interventions but as unseen scaffolding, an accepted feature of progress, invisible until questioned. These collective costs are harder to measure than individual side effects, but they are equally real. They appear in workforce expectations, educational inequality, healthcare strain, and widening economic dependence on pills to sustain unrelenting pace. The social system adapts until focus without chemistry becomes the exception. And perhaps the most striking cost is cultural, the quiet erosion of what people expect normal human functioning to look like. As a viewer, this raises a question worth pausing on. If so much of our measured performance is propped up by chemical reinforcement, should workplaces, schools, or even nations measure success differently? Do you think our standards should shift once we recognize how dependent they've become on stimulants? That reflection leads us to the uncomfortable truth. Stimulants may have begun as tools to help individuals push back against limits, but as they spread, the balance has tilted. Instead of us using them to resist fatigue and distraction, the systems around us grow stronger by depending on their presence. Amphetamines offer short-term solutions to fatigue and distraction, but in the process they create longer-term dependencies, both for individuals and the institutions that benefit from chemically extended focus. They address immediate pressures while quietly reshaping what schools, workplaces, and even families define as normal performance. The real question isn't whether stimulants work, they do. It's whether we want a culture that treats biology as the problem, or whether the systems demanding non-stop output should be redesigned instead. Ask yourself, should pressure be solved with pills or by changing those structures? Share in the comments if you've seen stimulants normalized in your school or workplace, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more balanced deep dives. And remember, the long-term effects of stimulant use depend on dose, duration, and individual vulnerability. Research is still underway.